Hello, class. We're going to be finishing the second half of chapter 11. This is part 2 from page 154 through 157. We're going to talk a little bit more about the mining industry, especially in northern Minnesota. So 164, a labor activist story, Anton Antila and the iron mining industry. 17-year-old Anton Antila arrived in the tiny mining community of Bewabik in 1906. He'd come all the way from Finland to live and work in Minnesota's Mesabi Range. Thousands of other Finns had done the same during this previous decade or so. It took Antila less than a day to find work in an underground mine nearby. Antila learned immediately how hard the work was. For more than 10 hours a day, he worked deep underground, shoveling iron ore into wheelbarrows and tram cars so the machines could lift it up the mine shaft. It was dangerous work. The mine shafts were dark and dusty and could collapse, especially when miners used dynamite to break up rock. A few months after Antila arrived on the range, 5 tram cars loaded with iron ore raced out of control and killed 6 men at a mine near Eveleth. The longer Antila worked at the mines, the more he became convinced that mining companies were treating him and his fellow miners unfairly. Hours were long, up to 14 hours a day, and since the miners were paid for the amount of iron ore they produced, instead of by the hour or by the day, they had to bribe the foreman to let them work in places where the ore was plentiful and easy to remove. An unlucky miner earned wages as low as $1.80 a day. By the summer of 1907, Antila and thousands of his co-workers had enough. They had joined the labor union and walked off the job, demanding better pay and working conditions. It was the first widespread organized strike the Iron Range had ever seen. The mining companies were determined to keep the mines open and force the labor union to give up its strike. They brought in replacements, immigrant workers from southern and eastern European countries such as Greece, Italy, Slovenia, Croatia, Montenegro. They hired hundreds of guards to protect the new workers and intimidate the strikers. Antila and other striking miners tried to convince the replacement workers, who they called scabs, to honor the strike. But most of the newcomers needed the jobs they had been offered. The mines reopened. Soon the men who had gone on strike began returning to work. The strike was over. The strikers had gained nothing. Minnesota's iron mining companies turned their attention back to other business, but they would be faced with labor concerns again and again in the years to come. Take a look at page 165 at the picture there. I'll read the caption. Miners were paid low wages for dangerous work in underground mines like this one shown in 1910 near Virginia. Unions working for workers. Labor unions in Minnesota across the nation began fighting for better pay and working conditions during the late 1800s, but success came slowly. Strikes like the one on the Minnesota Iron Range often failed to produce immediate improvements in the workplace. But eventually, workers and their unions began to make progress. During the first 4 decades of the 1900s, successful strikes took place in other states and industries such as textile, steel, and railroads. The U.S. government also passed a variety of federal laws that benefited working people. By the middle of the 20th century, combined efforts of labor unions and government reform had achieved all the aims listed on the chart below. On page 165, you can see some of the charts, the issues that people were having for work, common working conditions, and aims of the labor movement. So Minnesota's iron was mined in 2 different ways. Open pit mines, like those in Mesabi and the Cuyuna ranges, were mined by scraping up iron-rich surface soil and processing it. Underground mines, like those in the Vermilion Range, were mined by digging shafts and blasting out the iron deposits with the dynamite. The Mesabi and the Cuyuna ranges were once actually hills, so much of the iron ore has been mined in the hills that the hills are no longer there. After the ore was removed, many of the open pit mines in the Cuyuna range filled with water. They were stocked with fish, and now the lakes are popular recreation sites. The Mesabi Range gets its name from an Ojibwe word meaning giant, a reference to the Ojibwe story that giant lies beneath the hills. So in northern Minnesota, eastern Minnesota, north of Duluth, up on the Iron Range, just for your information, it was an old mountain range there, and underneath the mountain, the spine of the mountain was pure iron ore, not pure, completely pure, but a lot of iron ore all the way down the spine of the mountain, and that was very iron-rich material that many industries were started with the automobile industry. World War II got a lot of its iron from there to build tanks, ammunition, planes, engines, and trucks and cars. Page 166, the iron mining equation. Most of Minnesota's iron ore was less than 100 miles away from Lake Superior, and that was an important part of the industry's success. Trains hauled ore from mines to the lakes. From there, large ships carried the iron ore to mills in Pennsylvania and Ohio, where it was turned into steel to use in skyscrapers, bridges, railroads, cars, trucks, and automobiles. But proximately to Lake Superior was just part of Minnesota's success in mining, meaning it's close by the lake so it can travel easy. Natural resources. Minnesota state geologists first reported finding iron ore in the northeastern part of the state in 1865, but it wasn't until the 1890s that the true magnitude of Minnesota's iron wealth became clear. In 1890s, brothers Leonidas and Alfred Merritt discovered that part of the Mesabi Hills north of Duluth were covered with soft granular iron ore that could be shoveled up like dirt. They had found the iron deposits of what would be soon called the Mesabi Range. As it turned out, the Mesabi, along with smaller Vermilion and Cuyuna ranges, formed one of the largest masses of high-grade iron ore in the world. Machines, to be profitable, iron mining requires an enormous investment in heavy machinery and transportation. But the mining companies could make any money. But before the mining companies could make any money, they had to build roads to haul the iron ore to Lake Superior. They had to construct iron ore docks on the lake shores of Duluth, two harbors, and Superior, Wisconsin. And they had to build a fleet of ships to carry the ore across the Great Lakes. At first, they used massive steam-powered shovels to dig out the ore of open-pit mines and steam-powered trains to haul the ore to Lake Superior. As technology progressed, electric shovels replaced the steam shovels and diesel engines replaced the steam trains. People. Page 167. Minnesota's iron mining industry was dependent heavily on the men who worked in the mines, but needed more than labor. It needed the money of the people who were willing to take tremendous financial risks. The 7 Merritt brothers of Duluth were among the first of those risk takers. They made and lost their family's fortune between 1890 and 1895. But as the promise of the industry grew, Eastern investors with deeper pockets stepped in with even more money. During the 1890s, several of the country's most powerful industrialists invested in mining operations in the Mesabi Range. A few of them, such as John D. Rockefeller, J.P. Morgan, and Andrew Carnegie, were well known. Others, such as Henry Oliver, were less famous but just as influential. All of Duluth's Merritt brothers lived in the East and took the money they made from Minnesota iron ore out of the state. After striking in 1907, Anton Antilla returned to the mines, but he didn't stay there long. He had earned a reputation as a union troublemaker, the kind of worker the company didn't want around. After a few days back on the job, he was fired. He looked for another mining job, but no one would hire him. I had been speaking my mind, he later recalled. I got blacklisted. Antilla turned to farming and never returned to mining. But his labor union efforts made a start of the long struggle to improve the lives of the Iron Range workers. In the years that followed, miners on the Iron Range continued their attempts to bargain with companies. In 1935, U.S. Congress passed a law that made it easier for miners and other working people to form labor unions to bargain collectively with their employers. Finally, in 1943, after 36 years of the first strike, miners on the Iron Range signed their first contract with the mining companies. The flour milling, lumber, and iron mining industries continued to drive Minnesota's economy well into the 20th century. Abundant natural resources, technological inventions, and hardworking, enterprising people all played vital roles in creating a thriving business economy in Minnesota. If you look on page 167, you can see Anton Antilla bought a farm near Palo in northeastern Minnesota. Here he poses with his family in front of their farmhouse. Okay, that's part 2. Thanks, guys. Have a great day.